The summer of 1963 started like any other across the Midwest, with farmers watching the skies and timing their hay cuts with the precision their grandfathers had taught them. But by August, something had shifted. Farmers who had been stacking hay the same way for generations were suddenly rebuilding their entire storage systems, creating structures that looked more like fortifications than simple hayricks. Neighbors who passed by these farms stopped their trucks, got out, and stared at what looked like solid walls of compressed hay rising 15 feet high, each bale locked into place with an engineering precision that seemed almost military in its discipline. What happened that year wasn't written up in the agricultural journals until months later, and by then the technique had already spread across 6 states through nothing but word of mouth. The National Weather Service had recorded something alarming in their data. Severe storm frequency in the Midwest had increased by 43% between 1958 and 1963, with average wind speeds during summer storms jumping from 52 miles per hour to 67 miles per hour. Hail sizes had increased measurably, and the traditional protection methods that had evolved during more stable climatic periods were failing at rates nobody had seen before. James Whitmore ran a 200-acre operation outside of Bloomington, Illinois, raising beef cattle and keeping enough dairy cows to supply the local creamery. His father had taught him to stack hay in the traditional conical mounds, each one carefully shaped to shed water and allow air circulation, the bales arranged in overlapping patterns that had worked since the 1800s. This wasn't just tradition, it was practical engineering developed over generations. The conical shape directed rainwater away from the center. The loose stacking allowed air circulation that prevented spontaneous combustion from heat buildup, and the overlapping pattern created structural stability against moderate winds. In June of 1963, James had 43 of these haystacks scattered across his property, representing 600 tons of timothy, alfalfa, and clover that would feed his herd through the coming winter. At 1963 market prices, that hay represented approximately $12,000 in feed value, nearly half his annual operating budget. Each stack held roughly 14 tons of hay, with bales weighing between 60 and 80 pounds, depending on moisture content at baling time. The stack stood 8 to 10 feet high, with a base diameter of 12 to 15 feet, tapering to a peak that shed rain and snow. On the night of July 17th, a storm system moved through central Illinois with winds that the Weather Service later measured at 75 miles per hour, using their new anemometer equipment. James woke to a sound like a freight train passing directly over his house, and by the time he made it to the window, he could see hay bales tumbling across his fields like tumbleweeds. When dawn came, he stood in his barn lot and counted the damage. 31 of his 43 stacks were destroyed or severely damaged, with hay scattered across 3 properties. 300 tons of hay, worth roughly $6,000, was now exposed to the elements, and the forecast called for rain. The Agricultural Extension Service would later estimate that farmers across 7 Illinois counties lost between 25 and 40% of their stored hay during that single storm event. In McLean County alone, where James farmed, the total loss exceeded 8,000 tons of hay, representing over $150,000 in destroyed feed. Those numbers didn't account for the secondary costs: emergency hay purchases at premium prices, early cattle sales at depressed prices, or the long-term impact on breeding programs when farmers had to liquidate quality stock they couldn't feed through winter. James spent that day doing what he could, gathering what bales remained intact, covering damaged sections with tarps weighted down with tires and concrete blocks. But he knew the truth that every farmer knows when disaster strikes. Tarps fail, weights blow away, and rain finds every gap and weakness. By evening, the rain had started, and James watched from his kitchen window as water soaked into his exposed hay. His wife Martha sat at the table running numbers in a ledger book, calculating costs that kept getting worse no matter how she arranged them. That night, James drove into town and sat at the counter at Mabel's Diner, drinking coffee and trying to figure out if he could get through another year of farming. The conversation around him was the same calculation happening in different forms: how much hay could be salvaged, how much would have to be purchased, whether operations could survive the financial hit. Then Carl Benson walked in, and when someone asked about his storm damage, Carl said something that stopped every conversation in the diner. His hay was fine, all of it, even though the same 75-mile-per-hour winds had passed directly over his farm. The next morning, James drove out to Carl's farm just after sunrise. What he found looked like something from a military engineering manual rather than traditional agriculture. Instead of conical stacks scattered across the property, Carl had built what looked like a continuous structure running along the southern edge of his main pasture. It was 12 feet wide at the base, tapering slightly as it rose to 15 feet high, and it stretched for nearly 300 feet in a perfectly straight line. The structure contained approximately 400 tons of hay, compressed into 26,000 cubic feet of space, compared to the 38,000 cubic feet that same amount would occupy in traditional stacks. That 32% reduction in space requirements meant more efficient land use and better protection per square foot of footprint. Carl explained the engineering principles as they walked. Traditional haystacks relied on shape and loose stacking to shed water, but that same looseness made them vulnerable to wind. Each bale in a traditional stack was an individual unit held in place primarily by friction and the weight of bales above it. When wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, that friction wasn't enough, and bales would begin to lift and tumble. The conical shape that shed water so effectively actually created aerodynamic lift in high winds, the same principle that allows airplane wings to generate upward force. The wall method eliminated those vulnerabilities through compression and interlocking structure. Each bale was compressed against its neighbors with approximately 400 pounds of force applied by the tractor bucket, creating a friction coefficient high enough to resist winds up to 90 miles per hour. The running bond pattern, identical to bricklaying technique, meant that vertical joints between bales never aligned across layers, distributing stress throughout the structure rather than creating failure lines. The orientation of the bales, with cut ends facing the prevailing weather direction, meant that wind hit the dense compressed ends rather than the looser sides, and rain struck at angles that promoted runoff rather than penetration. Carl had learned the technique from a man named Robert Hutchins, a civil engineer who'd worked for the railroads before the war and spent time in France during his military service. Hutchins had seen French farmers using similar techniques in Normandy, where strong coastal winds made traditional stacking impossible. The French had refined the method over decades, developing precise specifications for bale compression, layer offset, and structural dimensions that European agricultural colleges had studied and documented. Hutchins brought that knowledge back to Illinois and shared it with farmers willing to try something that looked complicated and time-consuming. James asked the critical question, how long did it take to build and what did it cost in labor and materials? Carl's answer was detailed and honest. A traditional conical stack holding 14 tons of hay required 2 men working 4 hours or 8 man-hours total. Assuming the bales were already gathered near the stacking location, the same 14 tons incorporated into a wall section required 4 men working 6 hours or 24 man-hours total, a 300% increase in labor cost. However, that calculation didn't include the labor cost of rebuilding traditional stacks after storm damage or the value of hay loss to weather exposure and spoilage. The foundation work added initial cost but proved essential for long-term durability. Carl used railroad ties purchased for $2 each, requiring approximately 1 tie per 8 linear feet of wall. For his 300-foot wall, that meant 38 ties at a total cost of $76, plus the labor to position them and level them properly. The ties elevated the bottom course of bales 6 inches above ground level, preventing moisture wicking that caused bottom bale rot in ground contact situations. Agricultural extension data from 1965 would later show that properly founded hay walls had a storage life of 18 to 24 months, compared to 8 to 12 months for traditional ground-stacked hay. Within 3 days, James had committed to converting his entire operation to the wall method. He hired 3 high school boys at $1.25 per hour, the going rate for agricultural labor in McLean County during 1963. He calculated that building walls for his remaining hay would require approximately 400 man-hours at a labor cost of $500, plus $120 for railroad ties. Against that $620 investment, he balanced the $6,000 in hay he'd just lost to the storm and the potential for future losses every time severe weather moved through. The work started with foundation preparation. James and his crew used a transit level borrowed from the County Highway Department to establish truly level lines for the railroad tie placement. This precision mattered because any slope or unevenness in the foundation would translate into instability as the wall rose higher. They dug shallow trenches 4 inches deep, filled them with crushed gravel for drainage, then positioned the ties with their tops perfectly level within 1/4 inch over the entire length. This attention to detail seemed excessive for hay storage, but it reflected the engineering reality that structures 15 feet high require stable foundations, regardless of what they're built from. The actual wall construction followed a sequence that had to be executed precisely for proper results. The first course of bales went down with their longest dimension running perpendicular to the wall length, creating a 12-foot wide base. Each bale was positioned tight against its neighbor. Then the tractor bucket applied downward pressure until the bales compressed approximately 2 inches, or roughly 8% of their original height. This compression forced air out of the bale structure and increased density from the typical 10 to 12 pounds per cubic foot to 14 to 16 pounds per cubic foot, significantly improving weather resistance and reducing the spaces where moisture could penetrate. The second course went down in running bond pattern, with each bale centered over the joint between 2 bales below it. This offset was maintained through every subsequent layer, creating a structure where no vertical line ran straight through from top to bottom. The engineering principle was identical to brick or stone masonry, distributing loads and preventing crack propagation through the structure. James learned that maintaining this pattern required constant attention and planning, marking the position of each bale before placing it and checking alignment with a string line stretched the length of the wall. The orientation of individual bales within the wall followed specific rules based on weather exposure. On the south and west faces, which received prevailing winds and rain in central Illinois, bales were positioned with their cut ends facing outward. The cut end of a hay bale, where the stems are severed and compressed together, presents a much denser surface than the sides, where stems run parallel to the surface and create channels for water penetration. By orienting cut ends to weather, the wall presented its most resistant surface to the elements most likely to cause damage. The north and east faces, being relatively protected, could use side-out orientation, which actually made construction easier and faster. By mid-August, James had 3 walls completed, each one running 150 feet and standing 15 feet high. His total hay storage now occupied 4,500 linear feet of wall length, with an average height of 14 feet, storing 600 tons in approximately 48,000 cubic feet of space. The same amount in traditional conical stacks would have required approximately 70,000 cubic feet, meaning the wall method achieved a 32% space efficiency improvement. That translated directly to land use. James had freed up nearly 2 acres of ground previously needed for hay storage, which he immediately converted to additional pasture. The test came on August 23rd, when another storm system rolled through with winds measured at 82 miles per hour at the Bloomington Weather Station. The National Weather Service classification system rated this as a severe thunderstorm with wind speeds approaching weak tornado intensity. Hail fell with stone sizes ranging from 3/4 of an inch to 2 inches in diameter, large enough to dent car hoods and break windows. The storm duration was relatively short, approximately 25 minutes of peak intensity, but that was more than enough time to destroy exposed agricultural infrastructure. When dawn came, James walked out to survey the damage with genuine fear about what he might find. His house had lost 37 shingles, which he counted later when cleaning them from the yard. The machine shed had 2 broken windows. A section of wooden fence had blown down, but when he reached his hay walls, they stood exactly as he'd left them. Not a single bale had shifted position. The hail had pounded the exposed surfaces, and when James examined the impact points, he found penetration ranging from 1 inch to 3 inches deep, depending on hail size and impact angle. But the wall structure was 14 bales deep at its narrowest point, meaning even 3 inches of penetration affected less than 2% of the total hay mass. rain damage was equally minimal. James pulled several bales from different sections of the wall and split them open to check moisture penetration. The outer 2 inches of each bale showed moisture darkening, but beyond that depth, the hay remained dry and aromatic. In traditional stacks, rain penetration often extended 6 to 8 inches into the stack, and repeated wetting cycles could compromise hay quality throughout the upper third of the structure. The density and orientation of the wall stack had reduced penetration to less than 1/4 of traditional stack values. His neighbor, Tom Henderson, wasn't as fortunate. Tom had rebuilt his traditional stacks after the July storm, and the August storm destroyed them again. 22 stacks reduced to scattered bales and ruined hay. Another season's work gone in 25 minutes. Tom showed up at James's farm 2 days later, not to borrow tools or commiserate about weather, but to learn how to build walls before the next storm could hit. James spent that afternoon teaching him every detail Carl had taught him, walking through the engineering principles and the construction sequence step by step. Within a week, James had taught the technique to 9 different farmers, and all of them had started rebuilding their hay storage systems immediately. The urgency was real. Weather patterns that summer showed no sign of moderating, and farmers who'd lost hay twice in 5 weeks understood they were racing against time. The county extension agent, a man named Robert Morrison, who'd worked in agricultural education for 23 years, came out to document what was happening. Morrison had never seen a farming technique spread so fast through voluntary adoption, and he recognized immediately that he was watching something significant. Morrison conducted his own engineering analysis of the wall stacking method using equipment borrowed from the University of Illinois Agricultural Engineering Department. He measured compression forces, calculated load distribution, tested moisture penetration rates, and documented structural stability under simulated wind loads. His report, published in the Illinois Agricultural Extension Bulletin in November of 1963, provided the first scientific validation of what farmers had already proven through practical application. The wall method reduced hay loss from weather exposure by 78% compared to traditional stacking, improved hay quality retention by 43%, and increased storage density by 32%. Those numbers translated into real economic impact. For a typical 200-acre cattle operation in McLean County, converting from traditional stacks to wall storage reduced annual feed loss from approximately $4,800 to $1,050, a savings of $3,750 per year. The conversion required an initial investment of approximately $800 in labor and materials, meaning the payback period was less than 3 months. After that, the savings went straight to the bottom line year after year for as long as the farmer continued operations. The technique spread through the farming community faster than anything Morrison had documented in his career. By September of 1963, over 40 farms in McLean County had converted to wall stacking. By the end of 1964, that number exceeded 200. Neighboring counties showed similar adoption rates, and by 1966, the wall method had become standard practice across 7 states. Agricultural equipment manufacturers noticed the trend and began designing specialized tools, tractor bucket attachments that applied consistent compression force, bale orientation guides that helped workers maintain proper alignment, and foundation leveling systems that simplified the setup process. The agricultural colleges got involved, incorporating wall stacking technique into their farm management curricula. The University of Illinois ran controlled studies comparing hay quality after 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months of storage in walls versus traditional stacks. The results were dramatic. Hay stored in walls showed minimal degradation in protein content, digestible energy, and palatability even after 18 months, while traditional stack storage showed significant quality decline after just 6 months. For cattle feeders, that meant they could store hay longer without quality loss, giving them more flexibility in marketing decisions and reducing their vulnerability to seasonal price fluctuations. The regional economic impact was substantial enough to show up in agricultural statistics. McLean County cattle numbers increased by 11% between 1963 and 1967, despite a national trend toward consolidation and reduced cattle operations. Farmers who could protect their hay from weather loss could maintain larger herds on the same acreage, improving their income without expanding their land base. Feed costs as a percentage of total cattle operation expenses dropped from an average of 42% to 33%, a reduction that made cattle feeding profitable even during years when market prices were depressed. Insurance companies noticed the trend and began offering premium reductions for farms using engineered hay storage methods. Farmers who could demonstrate proper wall construction and maintenance received discounts ranging from 8 to 15% on their agricultural property insurance, recognizing the reduced risk of weather-related losses. Some insurance carriers went further, requiring wall storage or equivalent protection as a condition of coverage in high-wind areas, effectively mandating the adoption of techniques that farmers were already implementing voluntarily. The summer of 1967 brought the worst storm season the Midwest had seen in decades. The National Weather Service recorded 43 severe weather events in Illinois alone between June and September, with wind speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour in 17 of those events. 3 tornado outbreaks produced F2 and F3 intensity tornadoes that caused millions of dollars in property damage. Hailstorms destroyed crops across entire townships. Straight-line winds exceeded 90 miles per hour in multiple locations, producing damage comparable to weak tornado impacts. Farmers who'd stuck with traditional hay stacking methods were devastated. The Agricultural Extension Service estimated total hay losses across 7 Illinois counties at over 40,000 tons, representing approximately $750,000 in destroyed feed value. That number didn't include secondary economic impacts, emergency hay purchases, forced cattle sales, defaulted operating loans, and farm foreclosures that ended multi-generational operations. The human cost was harder to quantify but equally real, measured in families leaving agriculture after decades of work, communities losing population and economic activity, and rural areas experiencing accelerated decline. But farmers who'd adopted the wall method came through largely intact. James Whitmore lost one wall section during a particularly violent storm in July, when a large oak tree fell directly onto the structure, crushing approximately 30 feet of wall and destroying roughly 18 tons of hay. That represented less than 3% of his total storage, and he rebuilt the damaged section in 4 days with help from neighbors. His cattle went into winter with full feed supplies, and he actually sold 40 tons of surplus hay to farmers who'd been less fortunate, bringing in unexpected income of approximately $2,800. Tom Henderson had become expert enough at wall construction that he started a side business helping other farmers convert their storage systems. He charged 15 cents per bale for construction labor, which worked out to approximately $90 per 14-ton wall section. That was competitive with local hay hauling rates, and farmers were willing to pay because Tom's walls were built right the first time, with proper foundation work, correct compression, and precise alignment that ensured long-term stability. Between June and October of 1967, Tom built or supervised construction of over 200 wall sections across 4 counties, earning supplemental income that exceeded $3,000 for the season. The wall stacking technique had evolved through continuous refinement by hundreds of farmers trying slight variations and sharing results. Some farmers experimented with different wall widths and found that structures narrower than 10 feet or wider than 14 feet had stability issues that required additional engineering. Others tested various foundation materials and determined that treated railroad ties provided the best combination of durability and cost-effectiveness, though concrete block foundations worked well in areas where ties weren't readily available. A few farmers tried building curved walls instead of straight sections and discovered that curves added significant complexity without providing meaningful benefits. Regional variations developed based on local conditions and available materials. In wetter areas of Illinois and Indiana, farmers built walls with steeper face angles, sometimes reaching 15 degrees from vertical, to improve rain shedding. In drier regions of Iowa and Nebraska, walls could use more vertical faces with angles of 5 degrees or less, simplifying construction while still providing adequate weather protection. Farmers in areas with heavy snow loads learned to build walls with reinforced top courses that could support the weight of accumulated snow without compression damage. The technique spread beyond cattle country into other agricultural sectors. Dairy farmers adopted wall stacking for the same weather protection and quality retention benefits, with the added advantage that higher quality hay improved milk production in their herds. Horse breeders used walls to store premium hay that commanded prices 3 to 4 times higher than cattle hay, making the investment in proper storage even more economically justified. Even grain farmers who kept hay for their work stock built small walls that held enough feed for their limited needs while providing weather protection that traditional stacking couldn't match. By 1970, agricultural statistics showed clear evidence of the wall stacking method's impact on regional farming economics. Average hay loss rates across the Midwest had dropped from 26% in 1962 to 11% in 1970, a reduction that saved farmers approximately $8 million annually in feed costs. Cattle operations showed improved profitability despite challenging market conditions, with farmers maintaining consistent herd sizes rather than liquidating animals during harsh winters. The technique had become so standard that agricultural lenders began requiring proper hay storage as a condition for operating loans. Recognizing that farms with adequate feed protection were better credit risks, James Whitmore's operation continued to prosper through the 1970s, supported by hay storage methods that required minimal maintenance and provided consistent protection year after year. He'd calculated that his walls had saved him over $60,000 in prevented hay loss and avoided emergency feed purchases over 15 years, not counting the value of improved cattle performance from better quality feed. His herd had grown from 70 head in 1963 to 130 head by 1978, an expansion made possible because he could store enough high-quality hay to support more animals through winter. In the spring of 1978, another massive storm system moved through Illinois with winds that exceeded 100 miles per hour in some areas. The National Weather Service classified it as a derecha, a widespread convectively induced windstorm that produces damage equivalent to tornado impacts but affects much larger areas. The storm caused over $12 million in property damage across 7 counties, destroyed hundreds of buildings and killed 6 people. For farmers, it was the kind of weather event that previous generations would have considered catastrophic and unavoidable. James and Martha went to their basement as the storm approached, listening to the wind roar overhead and feeling the house shake on its foundation. When they emerged 40 minutes later, they found their house had lost most of its roof, and several outbuildings had been destroyed or severely damaged. But every hay wall stood intact, protecting the 640 tons of feed that would carry James's cattle through another winter. The walls had survived winds that destroyed buildings, uprooted trees, and overturned equipment, proving that proper engineering could overcome weather conditions that seemed beyond human ability to resist. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating piece of American agricultural history, please subscribe to our channel. Give this video a like and share it with others who appreciate the ingenuity and resilience of farming communities. This video is inspired by real facts and true events from American farming history and is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group. James Whitmore is a representative character reflecting the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar challenges and developed innovative solutions during the 1960s and 70s.